Welcome to Tech News Briefing. It's Monday, August 21st. I'm Zoe Thomas for the Wall Street Journal. Top of mind for many educators this school year is what kind of impact will generative artificial intelligence tools like ChatGPT and Bard have on students' learning?
And it really makes this much loftier question of what is learning outcomes, right? And we have to redefine it.
Today, on the second installment of our series, Reading, Writing, and Algorithms, we're going to explore that question. By the way, if you haven't yet, check out our first episode. We'll link that in our show notes. To figure out exactly how students could be affected by generative AI, TNB's producer Julie Chang visited with some teachers as they prepared to return to the classroom. Julie picks it up from here.
It's the Friday before the fall term kicks off at Santa Teresa High School in San Jose, California. It's a public high school serving about 2,200 students. It has over 160 staff members and a pretty diverse student body with a large Latino population. A group of 7 teachers whose subjects range from math to English to social science met up in a classroom. They formed a circle, sitting in the students' desks, gathering to collaborate across disciplines and plan for the year ahead.
So, how many students do you think?
If I take mine, I'll probably take maybe 2 or 3 classes at most.
If I take all the AP Human Geo students, I need 12 chaperones.
It's a kind of conversation I'm familiar with. Before I made the pivot to journalism, I used to be a teacher myself. I worked mostly in higher ed. I taught freshman composition at a couple of community colleges. You probably remember it as English 101. That was my bread and butter. So when generative AI tools started going mainstream, naturally, I wondered what it would mean to teach in a world where these tools are so readily available, and how educators would ensure students were still meeting their learning goals. So I visited Santa Teresa and sat in on their teacher meetup to find out how they're grappling with it. In subjects such as coding, it's difficult to prevent cheating, and the impact could be dire. Students who use generative AI run the risk of not attaining the skills to code on their own. That's according to Carol Ng, who teaches coding at the school.
They can always just put it in ChatGPT and the program came out. But it gets to the point where I really cannot tell whether the student did their homework or not. Because I guess with English, you know the style, of your students. But program is program.
Code is code, yeah.
Yeah, it's really hard. So I don't know how I'm going to make sure my students are actually doing the work these days.
How do you normally test them?
Unfortunately, I let them just write the program or whatever. I'm thinking the coming year, I may actually use a paper test. Like no computers, everything, switch off, write me this program by hand, which is ridiculous because we don't do that. But how else can you check if a student really learned?
I'm wondering, Carol, I don't know much about coding, right? But then
That's Jason Chang. He's a social science teacher at Santa Teresa. He's looking for ways to work with AI.
I'm assuming if they're given the same problem for them to create a code or something, is it possible for you to kind of create a problem for them to go now go back to the code and find faults with it or how you can do things differently? And could that be...
This kind of exchange, whether teachers should bring in generative AI tools into their classes or not, is playing out across the country. And it's not an easy decision. For educators, the essential objective they have to keep in mind throughout their course is learning outcomes, the specific skills and information that students are expected to attain by the end of a class. Sarah Randazzo is an education reporter with the Wall Street Journal.
States really closely track what students should learn every year and have very detailed outcomes listed for every grade level, every subject. Every teacher knows this is what I'm supposed to be teaching my students by the end of the year. And at a super simplified level, say, before you can read, you need to learn what sound each letter makes and how letters work together to make sounds, and then you can learn to read. So everything's a bit of a progression, if you will. Before you can do algebra, you need to learn how numbers add together. But if you can't do those benchmarks along the way, it'll ultimately catch up to you later when you're trying to learn more complex topics.
So how do teachers ensure that students are hitting their benchmarks? That question gets a lot trickier with generative AI tools. But Chang sees this moment as an opportunity.
And it really makes this much loftier question of what is learning outcomes, right? And we have to redefine it. The pandemic was a great time to redefine it, but we just band-aided everything. And then we kind of lost out on that reimagining.
One area of study that generative AI is bound to have a big impact on is writing. Programs like ChatGPT and Bard can produce essay-length answers to prompts in mere seconds. So how could that disrupt writing classes, and what will it mean for the learning outcomes of those classes? Mark C. Marino is a professor of writing at the University of Southern California. He taught composition for over 25 years, and he's director of USC's Humanities and Critical Code Studies Lab. It's a lab that looks at the intersection of computer science and the humanities.
For me, writing is thinking. And so on the one hand, we are teaching the skill with language arts, communication, interaction, but more importantly, writing is the manifestation of someone's thought process. And so when we're helping them with that process, we're helping them to develop their reasoning skills, their logic. You're in danger if you outsource that whole process to a chatbot of short-circuiting the whole reasoning process. A poor analogy perhaps is to have somebody else do your workout for you, right? I mean, at the end of the day, someone has worked out, something has been lifted, but you've not acquired any of those benefits by any means.
But Marino isn't anti-AI. In fact, quite the opposite. Since the launch of ChatGPT last winter, he wanted to see how writing instructors could incorporate generative AI tools into not only their lessons, but also their overall approach to teaching. So Marino ran an experiment over the summer. He brought AI into his class, teaching the first ever writing course at USC themed as machine-assisted writing. From the get-go, he made it clear students would be using large language models, or LLMs. That's the software underpinning chatbots like ChatGPT, which are trained on public data.
I said, we're going to use them, and we're going to see if they help our writing process, and we're going to admit when they don't, and we're going to test these systems rather than try to police them or ban them or run from them.
One activity Marino came up with was based on the Turing Test. The Turing Test, created by British mathematician Alan Turing, was a test from the 1950s that suggested if you were having a text-only conversation with a computer and you couldn't tell it apart from a human, then it might be intelligent.
And so inspired by that imitation game, I've had my students answer a question, and they answer it for themselves in, let's say, 5 or 6 sentences, and then they have an LLM like ChatGPT answer the question as well. And then we go into a forum where they submit one of the answers, either their own or the LLM's answer, and they don't tell us which is which. So then we read through all the answers, and the class together makes speculations and votes on which ones they think are written by the LLM, which ones by the students. And to my surprise, we had a very difficult time telling which ones were written by which.
After conducting that and various other exercises, Marino says he came away from the course with 2 main takeaways.
The ability for students to get something out of these systems that's really going to help them is somewhat dependent on how strong their writing skills are to begin with. And so if they have relatively weak writing skills and they're going to rely too heavily on these devices, then the systems are a disruption to their learning because they're going to put too much stock in what the system outputs. On the other hand, if a student has maybe more intermediate skills with writing, then they can see that these systems can supplement what they're doing, not take the place of their writing process.
In other words, yes, some students are able to meet the learning outcomes for a writing class, like being able to write an analytical essay or develop a sense of writing voice and style, despite the ubiquity of these AI programs. Some might even be able to use the tools to improve their skills. But plenty of others are bound to get left behind. And Marino says students who start out with a disadvantage, people like first-generation college students or English language learners, are likely to see those inequities exacerbated with the use of generative AI. And he says the ripple effects of relying on these tools will go beyond the classroom.
The student who turns to it or feels compelled for grade reasons or other reasons to turn to it as to provide them with some paragraphs that are good enough, and we lose their voices in the process, their voices that may have already been excluded by the models that have been trained on majority culture language to begin with and majority culture ideas to begin with, then suddenly this whole experiment of democratizing writing that builds communities out of very diverse voices starts to get whitewashed in a way that is unfortunate for the whole learning enterprise.
While students and educators are figuring out how all of this will play out, there's something that could affect them both: education technology companies and the programs they hope will disrupt things further. Join us next Monday for the third and final installment of our series, Reading, Writing, and Algorithms. In the meantime, you can catch regular episodes of Tech News Briefing the rest of this week. And if you want more tech news, check out our website, WSJ.com. TNB is hosted by Zoe Thomas. Our supervising producer is Melanie Roy. Our executive producer is Chris Zinsley. We had editorial support from Aisha Al-Muslim, Falana Patterson, and Chastity Pratt. This episode was mixed by Jess Fenton, and I'm Julie Chang. Thank you for listening.